first of all, thank you so much, Dr. Kaini and Dr. Mahalingam for presenting your work. I really enjoyed that as a postdoctoral fellow. I work on health policy issues and I can correlate with what you are talking. So I have questions for both of you. First question for Dr. Kaini is, you mentioned briefly towards the end of your speech that Ambedkarite Buddhists also see in Buddhism the idea of social justice, right? And in my observation, I'm seeing that in North America and UK, that idea of social justice is also propagating with Ambedkarite, trying to settle in this part of the world. And now the debate on social justice is also picking its pace. Do you see that is also happening? Do you agree to that point of view? If you see what is happening in Seattle, in California, they're trying to come up with bills on, anti-caste, concept. So, do you see the idea of social justice is also propagating with Ambedkarite Buddhist, moving to different parts of the world? That is question for you. And for Professor Mahalingam, I wanted to ask, my work also revolves around workplace well-being and mental health. And very recently, US Surgeon General actually published his report, and he gave his framework to work on workplace well-being. But many of the initiatives nowadays are very much centered on fixing the problem for the employee. They do not look at what employer is doing to the employee. And mindfulness and all these training sessions I have been proposed as one of the solutions. But they're very self-centered. Nobody is talking about the other determinants of at that workplace which influence that person's behavior. So my question to you is how these training sessions can be transformed to train managers and make them more aware and make the situation better for employees as well. Thank you.
So thank you for two very articulate questions. This very, very much appreciates the engagement with our work, and then, yes, helping to think beyond it. What I've seen, and I want to be very careful and preface what I say here, is that obviously all of you are engaged already in lots of things on the ground, some of which I'm not aware of. And I'm coming at this as a researcher who grew up in a different part of the world and who is just starting to become familiar with things. And so, of course, my perspective on things is necessarily going to be different than I think many of yours. So there'll be things that I'll be wrong about, there'll be things I'll be uninformed about, but also because I'm looking from a different perspective, maybe sometimes I see some things that might not be apparent to other people, I'm not sure. So our Ambedkarites around the world also being very active in social justice issues, sure, yes, of course. The challenge that I think, that I see, is when we're thinking about social justice in different parts of the world, there are already other people who are talking about social justice, meaning something else. And so we use this term, social justice, and it can be a little misleading sometimes, as if this is only one thing that we're all aiming for. Actually, there are a whole lot of people who are aiming for lots of different social justices. And because they use that word doesn't mean necessarily they're working together. So that's one thing that I've observed sometimes with the groups that I've spoken with in different parts of the world is it's one thing, I think, to advocate for the inclusion of anti-caste language in non-discrimination policies, for example, in Seattle, in California, in various universities around the world. Around especially in North America. It's one thing to do that, and that makes it very understandable. Another challenge with that is, though, that it's happening in an environment where a lot of people don't understand caste at all, like non-Indians, the whole idea of caste just doesn't make sense. And so to advocate for anti-caste legislation, there's this aspect of communication that happens across even to other communities in order for them to even understand what the anti-caste motion is. And that's the challenge, I think, with social justice. And at the end of my talk, the alignment of Ambedkarite and Burakumin people in Japan, which has been a really challenging way, that has, as much as we might think, well, oppressed people in different places, historical discrimination, they should naturally find ways to work together. That's actually not been very easy in Japan. And so the challenge of deeply understanding how somebody else is conceiving of social justice, and how somebody else who does not have our same group background, finding that intersectionality, finding that way of communicating our concerns and truly understanding their concerns, that seems to be something that's still kind of growing. I'll say it that way. I hope does that kind of address your question? Good, thank you.
Thank you for the question, which is important, which is the major debate. My work really rests in this debate, right? So a lot of times people think mindfulness, if you become mindful, it will fix your problem. So corporations don't want to really address the structural issues, which you implied. So we call this kind of mindfulness corporate mindfulness, or what we call the McDonaldification of mindfulness, called Mac mindfulness, like a fast food. You 15 minutes, you meditate, you go back to work, you feel good, without changing the system. So in my work, it has been critiqued how mindfulness has been co-opted in a particular way. So in my work, what I'm trying to do is, by pushing the idea of dignity, mindfulness has to be accountable. Mindfulness is not the individual fix, which is important at some level. We have to better improve our self-regulation, everything. But the ultimate goal is, am I reducing dignity injuries around my workplace? That's what I study. How to really minimize dignity injuries by pushing, using the mindfulness practices to make institutions more accountable. Not just putting everything on the burden on the individual. So you become mindful, it will be good for you. So if there is a problem with you, you are not practicing mindfulness, right? So that really, we are questioning that. So my work on dignity really was the question. That's why I really bring the social justice component, where of course, when I talk to I do a lot of training workshops. My website is called mindfuldignity.com. If you go there, you can download all the things and how to improve workplace, doctors, I work with doctors, nurses, how to improve their interaction while also changing the structural problems they're facing. And how to really make the question. So by bringing dignity, we really make the question more interesting and also relevant to how people actually feel workplace indignities or mistreatment, right? So that has been often not talked. If you're depressed, there is a problem. But not what happened in the workplace, right? How you've been treated in the workplace. I've been studying janitors in Maharashtra, in Mumbai malls. So people, how they don't even pay attention to them in the malls. These are one of the wealthiest people. But something happens, if anything missing, let's say a teenager goes to the bathroom, leave their cell phone, she thinks the janitors take the cell phone, which is not the case because there is camera all over. So there are these stereotypes, how it hurts them, and how to really make the institutions a little more accountable to these questions. That's what I call the more socially, more social justice focused mindfulness. Thank you. Anybody else?
Anybody else? Any other questions?
Jai Bhim. I am Prerna. I am a PhD student at Northwestern University in the Rhetoric, Media and Publics program. Thank you, Professor Koini and Mahalingam, for your wonderful and enriching presentations. I have a question to Professor Koine. So this comes from my observation. I am from Pune, and I've been going and working in Nagpur for some time. And to me, I think your research is very significant. But I would really like to know from you that, from your observation from such a long time of Buddhism in Nagpur, for me, I think. From what I've seen is that the influence of foreigners, as in Japanese or Taiwanese or Sri Lankan Buddhism in Nagpur, has actually influenced Navayana Buddhism in some manner, that it has somewhat become a little more apolitical, I would say. I think it's a larger word to say that, but it is also distancing Ambedkarites from Ambedkarites' idea, and have become an influence of only becoming Buddhist, or not being close to Ambedkarite ideals. So what do you think about it?
Thank you. That's a fantastic question. If I had had more time, I could actually talk directly about that point, because I think, so I'm eventually going to be writing a book on this research, and that is the central issue. So as I've talked with various Ambedkarites, there was one in particular, Dr. Santosh Raut, Maithavirnagarjuna. So he very helpfully talked about two poles, and I'm sure this is not news to you, but two poles between, that Ambedkarite Buddhists tend to operate between, the political pole and the more spiritual religious pole. And I've certainly talked to a lot of Ambedkarites, as I'm sure as you have as well, who are more on the political pole, who are very suspicious of like meditation and any of this stuff that like kind of takes the edge off of people. Like we have to, there's a fight that people need to, a real struggle that needs to be met. And if we're meditating and doing other things, maybe that pulls us away from it, or draws us into other issues. So on that political pole, that's genuinely there. And at the same time, a Buddhist identity for a lot of these people is still extremely important as a marker of political and social difference. So Buddhism, that word, is still there, and I definitely don't want to say that these people are bad Buddhists or they're not doing it right. That's not my role. And I don't think it helps us understand what they're up to. And there's obviously a lot of people who are doing something between these two poles. It's not as if somehow it's only one or the other. It's usually a combination, and people situate themselves in different ways. The challenge with the international side is that the way of talking about Buddhism, at the very end of my talk, I talked about, I brought up the slide registers of Buddhism, but I didn't say a lot about it. I think this registers of Buddhism idea of like a sociolinguistic register of how we talk about certain things in certain contexts, right? We don't talk to our grandparents in the same way that we talk to our friends. We use a different way. It might be the same language, but we know we have to be like respectful, and there's sort of different ways that you manage that. There are then, talking about Buddhism also, different registers. Think about how politicians talk about Buddhism as like international soft diplomacy. That's utterly different than Ambedkarite Buddhists. As this international engagement grows, the challenge is for Ambedkarites, I think, and for non-Indian Buddhists, to recognize what is distinctive about Dr. Ambedkar and his approach to Buddhism. I've been giving talks around the world this past few years, and there was one in particular I gave in Taiwan to a group of Buddhists at a Buddhist university there. And they were very respectful. I was talking about Ambedkar and his Buddhism, his idea of Buddhism and his movement. And the Taiwanese were very respectful. But it was also clear that they were like, is this really Buddhism? This doesn't sound like Buddhism. And one of the professors there, the Taiwanese professors, later said that she was in an elevator with one of the students who literally said, that's not really Buddhism. A lot of this comes back to like what counts as Buddhism. What does it mean? And I think that's going to be a challenge for Ambedkarites going forward, since we can say Navayana, not everybody uses that term, but what constitutes the essence of Buddhism following Dr. Ambedkar, following that social context, following that struggle, that still needs to really be worked out, because that's something that a lot of people in other Buddhist countries, it just doesn't register at all. And then I think, to my mind, the issue is still a problem of communication and understanding where someone else is coming from, but also, especially for Ambedkarites, to really deeply understand, well, what is it? What is the commitment? What does the Ambedkarite identity mean as one practices Buddhism? And at least from what I've seen, that's something that's still very much in motion. They have a really wide range of responses within the Ambedkarite community. Does that respond to your question? Thank you. Fantastic question.
So right, actually, what Kwame said is right, actually. So, Ambedkarite actually differentiate themselves from the Buddhism, what Baba Sahib has taught and what actually the other countries are following. So it is our duty actually to pass on the message and what are the things what Dr. Baba Sahib wanted to say about Buddhism. So they are not aware of that. So it's our responsibility to make them aware of what's going on and how we are actually come up. Actually, Baba Sahib did not have much time after converting to Buddhism to spread the message to all the people, like how we should practice in the daily life Buddhism, how we should have the compassion, how we practice the compassion and all these things. Unfortunately, I think within less time he passed away, but his literature is there, and I think all of the people, all of Ambedkarite should follow his, what are the thoughts on Buddhism he has expressed in his books, that we should pass on. So what actually Anna is also one of the things which what the thing we are carrying out this torch, and various we are celebrating Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar, we are celebrating Buddha Jayanti, we are celebrating Mahaparinirbana Nirvana, and then the conversion we took from the Buddhism. That also we all propagate and come together and spread that thing. So that we are doing over here, but it has to be in the other countries also. But actually, because of the less number of people, in US we are growing actually, of course. So you can see that 200 plus people are there already there. So in the other cities also will be there, but in like Taiwan and all these things, I think less number of people, Ambedkarites, are there who can spread these messages. So what you say is right actually. Thank you. Anybody else? Any other questions?
I have a question. Thank you, Dr. Kane and Professor Mahalingam. My name is Sandeep Goy, and I wanted to perhaps talk to both of you about your thoughts on what I think is I want to address the elephant in the room with the Ambedkarite community. So what I have observed, and I'm from Punjab, as you mentioned earlier, we have Buddhists from Punjab bringing Buddhism from especially UK, and that was in a beautiful moment in the Doaba area of Punjab, right around the Jalandhar district. In Punjab, what I've seen is Buddhism hasn't spread beyond that certain 2 or 3 districts. I talk to our people in Maharashtra and other states, and one of the things that I've observed personally is that even other faiths, like the minority, the Ravidasya faiths, and some of the Dalits or Sikhs, they still tend to fall back or be loosely connected to some of these Brahmanistic rituals. And one of the reasons when I ask them, hey, why are you following these practices? One of the big things that they say, and that probably plays into the element of human psychology, is festivals. They'll say, hey, you know what, we just like celebrating Diwali because it's lights and dance, Holi, it's playing with the colors, and our kids like that. So we are not practicing Hinduism or that faith or part of that ideology, but we just like the festivals. And when I look at other faiths, Buddhism and Sikhism and other religions in India that Ambedkarites follow, I want to know, I'm curious about what are your thoughts on the festivals, especially these traditions that bring people together, this song and dance and joy. And what I have realized is these people, Ambedkarites, they tend to fall back. And one of the reasons they fall back is because they are co-opted and they are slowly, they try to bring them back into the faith by saying, hey, just come for this event that is going to be a song and a dance event. And that psychologically becomes a gateway to falling into other practices which regress backward, which is completely against what Baba Sahib was preaching. So I'm curious to know what are your thoughts on that?
I think the debate is, within the Buddhist community there are many Buddhism. There is no one Buddhism. So I think Ambedkar should claim that engaged Buddhism, we are the earliest engaged Buddhists, and there are many engaged Buddhists too. So you can actually think about that. The question with with the rituals, it's very attractive for people to do that. So the closest example I will give you would be how you can embrace celebratory aspects of it while retaining your essence of what you want to do would be liberation theology in Catholics. So they celebrate Christmas, everything, but they are also very social justice focused. And there are a lot of, some of the Dalit Christians in India are very active about that part, where, of course, they celebrate Christmas, Easter, all those things. Plus, it's also like where we are going with this. What is this idea of love, fellowship, fraternity means to them? So I think what I'm saying is creating a language for this. For example, we can say Ambedkar Jayanti could be our social justice day, right? That could be our social justice day. So it's also, we should not forget, Ambedkar Jayanti also signals how we think about, how we thought about Buddhism and social change. Not many people have done that at the time. In fact, when his Nayana Buddhism came, traditional Buddhists didn't like the book. From Sri Lanka, they questioned it, if I remember right. So he wasn't afraid of it. So I think what I'm saying is, in some sense, we may have to do both because it's a very globalized country. So celebrating Buddha and those things are important, while also retaining the social justice part, what it means, right? Why we are doing this for social change. So liberation theologists do a very good job in Latin America. They're very good in India, Tamil Nadu definitely I know. So they are doing this. So I think we need to have both the torch. One torch is the celebratory part, other torch is the Ambedkar torch. So I think we have to do both. It's a lot of work for us, but it is important and worth doing it. So that's the really engaged Buddhist part. It doesn't mean we need to be, completely not to be dry and uninterested in these issues, because rituals sometimes are important to bring communities together, right? So Japan is also very interesting how the rituals, the people only go to Buddhist temple during either wedding or death rituals. These are the two times. But there's also other celebrations people participate, but they secularize those celebrations. So one thing Ambedkarites can take a lead is how to secularize these celebrations. So Ambedkar Jayanti could be our social justice Jayanti or whatever we call it. So that's our day to really talk about differences, reaffirm our commitment to making an egalitarian society. That's what he wants us to do. At least that's my understanding. So I think we don't have to give up on the rituals, but we don't have to forget this is what our mission, which is important.
I think that secularism part is very much important.
Well, so I think part of the challenge also is that the words that we use to organize what we're seeing in the world themselves are a little slanted and they're limited. They don't quite capture the complexity of what's happening in the world. So even the word secularism is a very, very loaded term.
It means very different thing in India or here?
Yes, it means very different things depending where we are. But also, I think if we mean it in sort of an Indian way of being inclusive of many different religions, that's very different than how you do it here versus how you do it in France versus how you do it in Japan. So there's that. The thing that I found, especially, I was very surprised when I spent 2 months in the UK back last year, interviewing people, especially in Birmingham, Wolverhampton, and in London. And so especially the Punjabis, I just was not so familiar with them. And so learning that there was a sizable Ambedkarite community in the UK and that it happened actually growing up in the UK came as a shock to me. I was not familiar with that. And talking with them too, I found that there was a very different, if I can say, sort of cultural attitude, and I think that's kind of what you might be referring to, where I didn't see, and I hope that I'm not going to get myself in trouble here. I'm just reflecting this in my observations, maybe they're wrong. I didn't see quite the same sense of maybe pride and confidence in a lot of the Punjabi communities that I spoke with that I saw in the Maharashtrian communities, especially the Maharashtrians coming from Nagpur. I think Nagpur is kind of extraordinary there, and maybe you can disagree with me if you'd like. I think there's a difference between Ambedkarites coming out of that Nagpur area and then in other parts of Maharashtra. There's just sort of a level of confidence and self-assurance that seems a little bit more natural, just probably because of the numbers and the history in there. But in any case, with the Punjabis, one thing that they pointed out was that in the UK, if they're Punjabi, everybody assumes if you're Punjabi, therefore you're Sikh. And like Maharashtrians don't have to deal with that. And so there's the distinction that the Ambedkarite Buddhists would say they're not Sikh, but then with the Ravidasis, they would say also that the Ravidasis are very anti-caste and then very politically active. In fact, I think even in North America, the Ravidasis have been some of the most politically active in terms of moving this legislation along. And they're not Buddhist. A lot of them, at least that I've spoken to, inherit Dr. Ambedkar, revere him in many ways, but don't become Buddhist. And so the Buddhists that I spoke with in the UK sometimes said that the Ravidasis would look to them and say, how come you have left our father? How come you abandoned our father? Meaning, how come you abandoned Ravidas? And so there was almost a sense of betrayal there, that by becoming Buddhist, they had left behind some of their culture, or left behind some of their identity that for the Ravidasis was not negotiable. And the Maharashtrians, I don't think, have to deal with that. Like, there's like, I don't know, leaving behind Sokamela or something, that doesn't kind of come up in the same way in Maharashtra as it does for the Ravidasis. And so religious identity can become a barrier to working together. And that's one of the big things I'm just very interested to see how people manage this. Because I've spoken with some Ambedkarite Buddhists who say that converting to Buddhism is the natural and necessary endpoint of Dr. Ambedkar's project. There are lots of Ambedkarites who have not converted to Buddhism. And when I was interviewing people in Dubai, the group that I actually talked with there would say maybe only half of them were Buddhist, maybe 2/3 were Buddhist, but there were a lot of people who were firmly committed to something else. And so finding that way of, either we call it like an Indian-style secularism, or finding a way to like hold on to a religious identity, but not to make it something that is a barrier to working with people who don't share that particular piece of the identity, but who do share other commitments, that's the real challenge. And there I think that might reflect back to, especially the Punjabi community, of like, how do they manage like the Ambedkarite Buddhist Ravidasi relationship and festivals and rituals. I don't know exactly how people here all see this, but at least growing up in the US, there's this very common idea that religion is about beliefs and ethics. And I think actually Dr. Ambedkar, to a large extent, he kind of reflected that based on his own reading and his own thinking. I think that undervalues the role that ritual and especially embodiment plays. And so that's why I think you have in a lot of traditions, you can say empty rituals, but I think there's an aspect of rituals and festivals that engages people's bodies that just sort of simply having ideas about the world doesn't do. And that's why like festivals and participating and like community relationships, the festival, we can say maybe it's slipping back as you did. I think a lot of it though is still also participation. Like, how do we participate and hold on to community bonds? Do we have to sever those if we become members of a different religious group? Or are there ways to still somehow hold that together? That I think is more, to my mind, a little more at the center of what people are, how they're negotiating that. We could say it's slipping back. I'm not sure, that's more of an evaluative way of looking at it. I'm not sure I would I would characterize it as that, but more of like people wanting to maintain their social bonds. So, yeah.
I also like to add one thing. Think about future of Anna, right? Here, religious communities over time form coalition. For example, Quakers and Unitarians, very strong social justice focus group as Protestant Christians. And they shared space. They also migrated to US from UK for this. They were persecuted, right? So in a way, we can also find alliances like that, so that we can reach out. They also, it's our responsibility to educate them about Ambedkar. Too many people don't know this is why he did it. So that kind of connection with the Jesuits, even Catholics who are the liberation theologians, Unitarians, Quakers, just name a few, involving them in some of the events. Also, partly we are building a social justice foundation with solidarity in a way, right? So while also celebrating the unique aspects of how we do things, that's important. So I think it will be important for us, next step is to connect to like-minded, value-based organizations, and how to have some difficult conversations like Ravidas says, have you left us, have you forgotten us, things like that. I think it's an important question for us to sit with them and discuss and build the solidarity. That's how solidarity movement we can build.
Yeah, thanks for telling that thing. Actually, we are actually working like that. So we are associated with the Muslim community also. We invite them in our events, and they participate there. We also go there, and this is a like-mindedness, how we are actually fighting for the justice, the equality, the same message we are passing to them, and they are also passing it to us.
And I think Anna is also, I want to acknowledge, Anna is also very actively collaborating with Priya Ambedkar Study Circle. We do a lot of events together over the years, that it's very, it brings so much joy for me, because when I came to this US 36 years ago, we were all minorities. I cannot even bring a non-vegetarian food for a potluck those days. There were only 5% non-Brahmins were in any school. So it's really, I can't tell you how happy to see these people here. It's important. Thanks.
That's a good point, actually. Okay, anybody else? Any other? Yeah, sure.
Jim. My name is Mahendra, and I'm coming from Louisville, Kentucky. Thank you, Dr. Kane and Malingam, sir. I have a quick question for Dr. Kane, that we talk more about the observations and your studies around the migrations of Ambedkar philosophy and Buddhism along with it to different countries. You also mentioned the problem that you might have seen in the third generation, right? Right now we are kind of first or second generation here, and if we foresee that problem of third generation happening around us, right? Do we have any kind of historical testimonies where we can refer to and say, hey, these were the things those were implemented by the first and second generations, and they were able to kind of carry on the legacy of, you know, whatever the religious practices or the faith they carried, it was inherited in them, and that kind of continued for the longer duration. So if you have any kind of thoughts or any kind of research or any kind of references to come back, that would be really great.
Well, thank you for that question. I'm going to be thinking about that a lot in the future. Off the top of my head, I don't have another sort of reference to say, oh, you should definitely listen to this group over there. My voice coming across still? Okay. Yes, I don't have an immediate reference to say, definitely pay attention to that group. They provide a great model. What I would say, though, is that just having a sensitivity to how the role of Buddhism in Dr. Ambedkar, what that means for somebody who grows up in a culture where they have a minority status that's configured for a very different reason, on the basis of ethnicity rather than of caste and religion. It necessarily shapes people differently. And I'm sure that all of you are negotiating and all of you are figuring out how do you maintain your relationships to your families in India. Because I assume that most of you still have extended family in India, people of some sort. And I also, as I've spoken with a lot of Ambedkarites, a number of them have actually said that they feel very unsure and even a little bit ashamed that they feel they haven't been doing enough for helping people coming from backgrounds they know are very difficult, and now they're more financially stable in, like in North America or Japan, and they're not sure what to do. And so figuring out that relationship is going to be a challenge. But in terms of the generations going forward, I think it's important to recognize Dr. Ambedkar's conversion and the nature of Buddhism as social democracy, and that is sort of distinctive from the other kinds of Buddhism that have centuries of history behind them. For the Ambedkarite Buddhist community going forward, already, as was mentioned, Dr. Ambedkar died only 7 weeks after he converted. So this is very much an unfinished project. This is rather different than, we could say, Jewish Americans, who have, say, 2,000 years of history plus. And then they come to a different place and then they establish their community. I don't think that's a comparable community to look at, because what it even means for Ambedkarites to be Buddhist is it's an ongoing project. That's something that you all, if Buddhism is important to you, that's something that you all are still kind of figuring out. And we can certainly look back to Dr. Ambedkar and what he wrote as guideposts, but it is an unfinished project. And that means that people will continue to be growing and developing and having to develop as they move into different contexts. So on some level, I think, I don't want to say it's completely unprecedented, but it's wise to look to other communities. There are some things that are rather unique about the Ambedkarites that I'm not sure there is anything that's entirely comparable. So it's a really good question. I'm glad that you're thinking about that, and that you bring this up publicly. I'll be thinking about it more in the future too. Thank you.
Yes, I agree that it is an ongoing project and we have to carry that thing. Then one more question, I think somebody was wanted to talk.
Good morning. Two great scholars today here. A lot of information, a lot of knowledge we are getting. We are so much benefiting in this very moment. I have a question that about the mind. 7 billion human beings in this planet Earth today. 7 billion human mind. Every being has an individual mind, and it appear and disappear. We know that, right? And mind control everything. So how the mind exists and how to came to the manifestation. I have a deep question about how it is come and it's appear and disappear, and it takes the great impact in our life, the mind. And Buddha said that the mind is the forerunner of all action, and mind is the chief, mind is the architect. We know that. And then the mind, actually how it is appear and disappear and impact our life. So I have a deep question about that, and we know that the mind is 32,000 thoughts appear and disappear a day. So how it came to the manifestation? I want to know that the deeper level of how it come to the thought. Thank you.
I think it's a very important question. Thank you for your comments and question. I think I'm going to borrow Jataka tale, a Buddha story, to answer your questions. So Buddha was walking with his disciples, and there was a big rock. So he asked his students, what is it? And they said, oh, it's a big rock. It's so big, it's a big boulder. Right. So his response was, if it is a big boulder, only when you try to push it. So when you people sit and meditate, I don't know, some of you practice meditation, the first thing you notice is, once you close your eyes, my students become their own filmmakers. There's a lot of movies going on in their head, the scripts, you're editing, you are the main hero, you're a script writer. Then you realize, oh my gosh, I'm meditating. So you come back to your breath. So the idea is, don't wrestle, don't push the boulder, just notice the boulder. If you're just noticing it, you're not pushing it, you are not feeling the pain. So it's not a big boulder, you just notice it. So the idea is all the thoughts coming in the practice is how to really think about this question, right? This is hard for young people because a lot of things are going on. So that is really one way, the way psychologists are trying to do is to look at the mind wandering, how do we experimentally we study. In about 10 years ago, we used to have the electrodes, when they are wandering, they used to raise their hand. So if our mind is wandering, they can raise their hand, we notice it. Now we can actually tell exactly what's neurologically where you are. Are you really meditating or wandering? So we can actually show that. So it really helps people to really think. For example, monks like yourself with a long meditation experience have a very different meditative state the moment you sit for meditation compared to new people, right? So these things help them to understand how long it takes to cultivate this. So how do, the famous joke I always, sometimes students in my class tell me, I ask them why you're taking the class. I'm not joking, some students write, I want to be enlightened by the end of the semester. I said, wow, we're paying very little money to do that. People have that lot of time spending. So I used to tell them the story. There is a very Zen story. The teacher, he says, how long I should meditate to become enlightened? He said, maybe, if you meditate for 5 years, you'll be enlightened. He said, okay, so if it means if I really 8 hours a day, maybe if I practice 16 hours a day, how long? It will be 2.5 years. So the teacher said, no, it'll take 10 years for you to be enlightened. So don't try too hard, So it's just how to be gentle, which is very important, how to be gentle. Some very important teachers meditation when education I received, they talk about how the regular state is the joyous state, how we have to really be this. Changmin, who developed this Search Yourself, the Google program for mindfulness, is a Korean Buddhist scholar. And he talks about how being just our regular state is a joyful state, to think about that, how to really be in the moment. And that's always a challenge. So it's really how to bring students back to this. So that's what the psychology is also trying to help them. We are all not fully there, but we are trying.
The question about mind, I think one thing that is also rather distinctive that I want people to be aware of is this. I think genuinely, in the last 15 years, as I've watched students change, as I've watched myself change, dealing with smartphones, social media, we're thinking about mind. Some of our mind now is somewhere else, in some cloud server or somewhere else. People, especially as you get generative AI and ChatGPT, so now I would imagine Ram would probably agree, like this year teaching has been substantially different than teaching in any other year because we know that our students are simply typing things into ChatGPT and kind of bringing stuff back and putting on the assignments. And they're not thinking very critically about what is actually going on there. And so there's sort of a reliability that you can find proper information with this thing. So as you're talking about, say, the boulder and pushing the boulder, I think the boulder is already being pushed. Google is pushing it, Facebook is pushing it, Meta is pushing it. It's being pushed out there, and these are the boulders, the minds that we have, and we're not, I think, fully cognizant of how these media forces are pushing us around. It's now just part of the lives that we live in. And I see it especially in my students as they've changed over the past 12 years that I've been teaching. There has been a change. And I have a lot of compassion for students now, especially if they've grown up around social media and been a part of like having an online personality that once they have this, say, Facebook post or Instagram or TikTok, whatever, that this seems to open up so many possibilities for anonymous people, or even classmates who hide like behind an anonymous username or something, do real psychological damage to each other. This feels to me like, I don't, physically it might not be exactly a more dangerous time, but psychologically this feels like a very, very dangerous time to be a young person. I have a lot of sympathy for how difficult that must be. And I think a lot of it has to do with mind and what we just assume, the way that we're affected by technology is a little out of control. And yeah, mindfulness is a good thing to have to hopefully pull us out of some of these, I would say, toxic relationships we have with technology that are simply default. I'm thinking of myself here, not just other people.
Is it the mind is ego or the mind is self?
The mind is ego or the mind is self? I think, well, for a lot of people just by default, if they're thinking about, say, how somebody responds to them on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok or social media, and they see some negative feedback, they see some negative comments, or people making fun of them or something, I'm thinking especially as young people, but even anybody, but especially young people, I'm not sure how many people have the ability to draw back and be able to have that distance, as you were talking about, Ram, which is, I think, very, very helpful, to recognize that the emotion doesn't have to be, like, essentially them, that the emotion is there. I don't think that people have that ability very, very easily. That's hard to achieve, especially for young people, and then it just has a very damaging effect.
Yeah, I think for my mindfulness class, they cannot use cell phones. It's very hard for them to do that in the beginning. And we also have a contemplative practice space. So when they come and work there, they have to leave their cell phones, everything outside. We have a special assistant to keep them so that they can work without this. So it's really important. It's a very long struggle for us. But we have to start something.
Yes, the power of actually thinking actually goes away with this social media and this small device. I agree with that. So I think we have one more question over here coming up.
Hello. Hey. Jai Bhim, and thanks for this informative session. I love psychology. It's one of my favorite subjects. I have a question for John Koide. My question is, you studied about Buddhism in various countries. Where do you see women in Buddhism? Do you see any gender disparities? And what is your point of view? And what is the other women's point of view on Buddhism? And I have a question for Professor Mahalingam. How do you cultivate mindfulness in the 3 generations where your first slide showed that we need to show the compassion, and the compassion between the 3 generations, I feel myself in the middle. I'm dealing with a teenager, and the other one is parents are older. How do you cultivate that mindfulness and fill those gaps to 3 different mindsets? One is there, one is myself, and one is other. That's my question. Thank you.
So, fantastic questions. Women in Buddhism, I'm teaching a class right now on Buddhism in South Asia, and so we are actually going to reach our final week next week. And this past week, throughout the entire course, there has been a challenge that throughout most of Buddhist history in South Asia, women have largely not been very present in the historical records, or we have to very proactively go out and sort of find them, because otherwise what has been represented has been by and large male. For Dr. Ambedkar, and from what I'm also seeing of interviewing Ambedkarite families around the world, it has been really quite uplifting to see how active the women have been, and how highly educated the women have been. I'm sure there are still plenty of challenges around, not to diminish that at all. And in fact, I'd strongly recommend, it's unfortunate that Professor Pike couldn't join us today, because that's something that she works on a lot. So if you have a chance to go and look at her scholarship, that would be fantastic. One thing that is rather interesting, though, is a group called Sakyadhita. Have you heard of this group? So I attended their conference. I happened to be in Korea last summer, and so I attended the conference there, and there were some 5,000 Buddhist women. I think I was probably maybe one of 50 men in this conference of 5,000 Buddhist women, which was kind of an interesting experience. But they're very active, and this is international. Ambedkarites there was one Ambedkarite speaker on the program that ended up as, she wasn't there for the session, so I didn't get to, that got canceled. I don't know how much Ambedkarites have been communicating with Sakyadhita at all, but this is a global movement, and they are quite active. But their main emphasis really is, though, bringing together Buddhists from especially more majority Buddhist countries. So there's a lot of other dynamics that are not really related to Ambedkarites. But there, women are extremely present. And for all of the time I've spent in Taiwan, too, women are extremely present in Buddhist traditions there. In fact, some of them, like Tzu Chi, is led by women, majority women, so this is rather extraordinary. There are some contemporary examples to be looking at. But yeah, I think from what I've seen, Ambedkarite women have been probably more on the cutting edge of being active and included, and even to some extent being leaders in a way that a lot of other communities have not been quite so much. And maybe part of that is because this is a relatively new movement, and that means the weight of tradition is not quite as heavy. Whereas, like, say, in Sri Lanka, there is a lot more weight and a lot more of people who would say, well, if the orders of nuns died out 1,000 years ago, that's just the way it is, and we can't change because it's been this way for the past 1,000 years. Ambedkarite people don't have to deal with that in quite the same way. So, just a few thoughts. I don't know if any of that is relevant or helpful, but I'll pass it.
Thanks for the question, and it's always a challenge as a psychologist to think about. When you think about, generally when we do mindful parenting, all those sessions when we train them, so a lot of times we see our children, we also think that, we are very sure that what we think is good for them is what they want. So that is really the big challenge. So we need to really be open to listen to them. Deep listening is important. The more we listen to them, then the generations can understand each other with compassion. But most of the time, each generation, the older generation particularly, for example, I can tell, oh my gosh, I walked 6 miles barefoot to go to school. I didn't have slippers. Now you have everything, so you're not studying. Because that doesn't have any meaning to them at all, because that's not what they see, how they see the world. So I think it's important to be open, and listening to both sides is a very important step. So most of the time, if we have a fixed view of thinking that this is the best way to think about it, that's going to really create more conflict, because we are not open to being in the mindful space where we are open to listen to them. And so that way, the conversation, the dialogue is open, which is important. So where the compassion practices will be helpful, loving kindness meditation we found, improve social relationship, people feel much better connected to other people. It also improves their emotions, things like that. So if you go to my website, mindfuldignity.com, so I recorded all the guided meditations. You can download it, it's free. There's also journaling. If you don't like to meditate, you can also download it. All of them are there, so there is different meditations you can practice 15 minutes. So I think this is one way to really help us to cultivate it. Then of course, practicing is the next one, how we're going to real life do that. So deep listening is one thing will be very helpful across generations we found. And also accept our children are not going to be as perfect as we are. The most, yes, that's what we think, so we should say that. So the most, what we call the immigrant paradox, people are in public health here. What we found was over generation, first, second, third generation, the health outcomes surprisingly goes down. That is, my grandchildren are more likely to have maybe prenatal baby, all those things, compared to myself. It's called epidemiological paradox in the literature. So I think we need to be really a lot more kind and compassionate to them to really help them to understand what's going on. And in the process, probably we can also understand their imperfections and accept them as they are. It's okay if my daughter doesn't go to Harvard. It would be nice, but she can go to Harvard. She wants to go to a school where she thinks it's important to her. And I think how to accept that is a big part of the being mindful, the compassionate part. Thank you. I hope I've answered some aspect of the question. I may not have the right answers, but this is something I've been thinking as well.
Yeah, understanding and actually practicing yourself. Actually, the kids actually follow you. So if you do that, something like that, I've seen one example in one. I was traveling in a bus, and the lady was reading a book, and then the small girl was also reading a book. Actually, normally you see the device in the hand, right, phone and all these things. So the other passenger asked her, why this small girl is reading a book rather than having a phone in her hand. He said that she follows me. So she is reading the book, that's why the kid is reading the book. So you lead the exam with the example. That's what I think.
We are running out of the time, so I think we'll take a last question before we break out for lunch.
Yes, so there will be only one last questions for this panel discussion, and then we take a photograph after that, and then we break for the lunch.
Yeah. Please be short with the question. Thanks.
Yeah. Please be short.
Good afternoon. Thank you. This is not going to be a question. My name is Majid Taj. My name is Majid Taj, and I'm actually representing the, as you mentioned, Indian American Muslim Council. Diversity, inclusion, and equity is really close to my heart, and that's why I'm here. And any support this organization needs, I'm here to extend my help. And again, I want to acknowledge and thank you for organizing this event here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So thank you, Dr. Koine and Dr. Mahalingam, for taking your valuable time to have the speech and the discussion in the forum and answering the question. Thank you very much.
Thanks for inviting us, JB.
Thank you for, especially for me as an outsider, allowing me to be in your presence and talking about issues that are obviously very central to you. I very much appreciate it. So thank you for that.